They whispered about the Duke of Westcott in hushed tones throughout the northern counties, the man who banned Christmas from his estate, the nobleman whose heart had frozen the night his wife and child perished in the snow. No one dared speak of holly or carols within his walls. Yet in a forgotten cottage at the edge of his vast lands, a widowed maid named Jenny Miller was about to change everything. With nothing but pine branches and hope, she would commit an act of quiet rebellion that would shatter the Duke's carefully built walls and remind him that love, like Christmas itself, cannot be forbidden. The December wind howled against the windows of Westcott Hall, but George Ashford, Duke of Westcott, barely heard it. He stood in his study, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, staring at the ledgers spread across his mahogany desk without truly seeing the numbers. At 38, he was one of the wealthiest men in northern England, master of lands that stretched beyond the horizon, yet he felt nothing but the familiar hollow ache that had become his constant companion. 5 years. 5 years since the accident that had stolen everything that mattered. The knock on the door was hesitant, apologetic even in its softness. "Come in," George said, his voice flat. "Mr." Pemberton, the head butler, entered with the careful movements of a man approaching a sleeping lion. "Your Grace, I have completed the inventory as you requested. The household is prepared for winter." George nodded without looking up. "And the reminder I gave you last week?" Pemberton cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Grace, I have informed all staff that no decorations of any kind are to be displayed. No greenery, no candles in windows, no singing of carols. The estate will observe the season with proper restraint." Proper restraint. What a civilized way to describe the suffocation of joy. George finally lifted his gaze to meet his butler's eyes. "Make certain they understand, Pemberton. I will not tolerate even the smallest infraction. No wreaths, no ribbons, nothing that suggests celebration. This house mourns, and it will continue to mourn. Of course, Your Grace." Pemberton hesitated, then added quietly, "Though the rest of the county celebrates, we shall remain as you wish, as I wish." George turned back to the window, dismissing the butler with a slight movement of his hand. What he wished was impossible. He wished for time to reverse, for the carriage wheels to find purchase on that icy road instead of sliding over the embankment. He wished for his wife Catherine's laugh to fill these halls again, for his son Thomas to come running through the corridors with his wooden soldiers. But wishes were as useless as prayers, and George had learned long ago that neither could bring back the dead. He drained the brandy in one swallow, welcoming the burn. Through the frost-covered glass, he could see the village lights twinkling in the distance. Even from here, he knew what those lights meant. Families gathering, children singing. The whole blessed county preparing for the holiday he had come to despise. Let them celebrate. Let them hang their foolish decorations and tell their empty stories of peace and goodwill. Westcott Hall would remain dark and silent, a monument to the truth he had learned that terrible Christmas Eve, that joy was fleeting, that love was a trap, and that the cruelest thing the world could do was dress up sorrow in ribbons and call it a season of hope. George poured himself another drink, but before he could raise it to his lips, Pemberton returned, his expression uncertain. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there is one more matter. The widow, Mrs. Miller. She has requested permission to occupy the old gamekeeper's cottage on the eastern edge of the property." George frowned. "The cottage near the woods? That place has been abandoned for years." "Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Miller is aware of its condition. She asks only for permission to live there with her 2 sons. She says she will make no demands for repairs or assistance." George's first instinct was to refuse. The cottage was barely habitable, little more than a ruin slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But then he remembered Jenny Miller, one of the downstairs maids, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of woman who moved through the halls like a shadow. He knew little about her, except that she worked harder than most, and never complained. "Why would she want that hovel?" "She wishes to bring her children home from the parish orphanage, Your Grace. She believes she can make it suitable with time and effort." Something twisted in George's chest, though he could not name the feeling. Perhaps it was the echo of his own isolation, or perhaps it was simply exhaustion with refusing people things that cost him nothing. "Tell her she may have it," he said finally. "But make it clear that I will provide no assistance." No repairs, no supplies, no special considerations. If she wants it, she takes it as it stands. I will convey your message, Your Grace." After Pemberton left, George returned to the window. Somewhere out there in the darkness, beyond his manicured lawns and frozen gardens, a woman was preparing to turn ruins into a home. The thought should have meant nothing to him, yet it lingered like smoke he could not wave away. He finished his brandy and rang for his valet. The evening stretched ahead like all the others, empty and interminable. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, and all the days until Christmas passed, and he could stop fighting against the tide of forced cheer that threatened to drown him each December. George Ashford, Duke of Westcott, had made his choice 5 years ago. He would not celebrate, would not pretend, would not allow the fiction of holiday joy to penetrate the walls he had built around what remained of his heart. In the village below, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening service. George closed the curtains against the sound and turned his back on the world. Some men killed Christmas with violence and fire. George had chosen a slower, more thorough method. He had smothered it with silence, buried it under routine and work, drowned it in brandy and bitter memory, and he had almost convinced himself that he had succeeded. Jenny Miller woke before dawn, as she always did. The servants' quarters were cold and cramped, 6 narrow beds lined against stone walls that never quite held warmth, no matter how much coal was shoveled into the small fireplace. She dressed quickly in the darkness, her fingers fumbling with buttons she could fasten by touch alone after 3 years of this routine. 29 years old, and sometimes she felt ancient. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and descended the narrow back stairs to the kitchen, where Mrs. Brennan, the head cook, was already kneading dough with practiced efficiency. "Morning, Jenny." Mrs. Brennan's voice carried the rough warmth of a woman who had worked in kitchens since childhood. "His Grace wants breakfast at 7 sharp. No delays." "Yes, ma'am." Jenny tied her apron and began her first task of the day, polishing the silver that would grace the Duke's solitary table. Her hands moved automatically, though she barely saw the gleaming surfaces she created. Her mind was elsewhere, calculating and hoping in equal measure. The cottage. Mr. Pemberton had delivered the Duke's answer last night. She could have it. She could bring her boys home. The thought made her hands shake, and she had to set down the butter knife before she dropped it. Daniel and Eli, 8 and 6 years old. She had not lived under the same roof as her sons for nearly 2 years, not since Jonathan's death in the war had left her with nothing but debts and a widow's pension too small to support 3 people. Every Sunday, she walked the 5 miles to the parish orphanage and spent 2 precious hours with them. She brought what little she could save from her wages, a sweet bun, a wooden toy carved by one of the stable boys, a book borrowed from the Westcott Library when no one was looking. She held them close and promised them that someday soon they would be together again. Someday had finally arrived. "Jenny, are you crying into that teapot?" Mrs. Brennan's voice startled her back to the present. She touched her cheek and found it damp. "No, ma'am, just the cold making my eyes water." The cook studied her with knowing eyes but said nothing. Everyone in the servants' hall knew about Jenny's children. They knew she sent every spare penny to the orphanage. They knew she mended her own stockings until they were more darning than original fabric, that she took the smallest portions at meals, that she never asked for time off even when she looked ready to collapse. They called her the widow who never complains, and they meant it with respect, though sometimes Jenny wondered if it might be more accurate to call her the widow who has no energy left for complaints. After breakfast service was cleared, Mr. Pemberton summoned her to his office, a small orderly room that smelled of leather and ink. "Mrs. Miller." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, a courtesy rarely extended to housemaids. "His Grace has granted your request for the gamekeeper's cottage. However, you must understand his terms clearly. You will receive no assistance with repairs, no supplies, and no special considerations. The cottage is to be taken exactly as it stands." Jenny's heart hammered against her ribs. "I understand, sir. It has been uninhabited for 7 years. The roof likely leaks, the chimney may be blocked, and there is certainly no furniture to speak of." Pemberton's expression softened slightly. "Are you certain you wish to proceed?" "I am certain, sir." Because she was. Because the alternative was leaving Daniel and Eli in that cold institutional building where children slept in rows and ate in silence and learned that the world had no place for them. Because even a ruin with holes in the roof was better than separation. Very well. Pemberton produced a key, heavy and rust-spotted. You may take possession immediately. Your hours here will remain the same until you have made the cottage suitable for habitation. Thank you, sir. Jenny took the key with trembling hands. Thank you. That afternoon, during her brief rest period, Jenny walked the half-mile to the eastern edge of the estate. The path narrowed as she moved away from the manicured grounds, becoming little more than a track through bare winter trees. Snow had fallen during the night, turning the world into a study in black and white, dark branches against pale sky, shadows stretching across virgin drifts. The cottage appeared suddenly, hunched between two large oaks like something trying to hide. Jenny stopped, her breath catching. It was worse than she had imagined. The thatched roof sagged in the middle, dark with rot. One of the two small windows had lost its glass, now covered by a piece of rotted wood nailed haphazardly across the opening. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and when she approached, she could see gaps between the boards wide enough to admit icy drafts. But it had 4 walls and a roof, mostly intact. It had a chimney, which meant a fireplace, and most importantly, it was hers, or at least hers to use. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door scraped open with a protest of wood against stone. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew and abandonment. What little light penetrated through the intact window revealed a single main room, perhaps 12 feet square, with a smaller chamber beyond that might serve as a bedroom. The fireplace was filled with old bird nests and debris. Mouse droppings littered the floor. Cobwebs draped every corner like funeral shrouds. Jenny stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking inventory. The walls were sound beneath the damp. The floor was flagstone, cracked in places but solid. With cleaning and patching, with determination and time, this could be made livable. This could be home. She knelt on the cold floor, her hands pressed against the stone, and for the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to cry properly, great shuddering sobs that echoed in the empty cottage. She cried for Jonathan, lost to war. She cried for the exhaustion that had become her constant state. She cried for Daniel and Eli, growing up without her daily presence. But when she rose, her tears had stopped, and her jaw was set with determination. That evening, after her duties at the manor were complete, Jenny returned with borrowed rags and a bucket of water begged from the kitchen. She worked by candlelight, scrubbing walls and floors until her hands were raw and her back screamed protest. Sarah, one of the other maids, found her there near midnight. "Jenny Miller, you are mad as a March hare. Come back to bed before you freeze to death." "Just a bit more," Jenny murmured, not looking up from the section of floor she was scrubbing. Sarah sighed and knelt beside her, pulling another rag from Jenny's pile. "Then I shall be mad with you. But only for 1 hour, mind. Some of us need our beauty sleep." They worked in companionable silence, 2 women scrubbing away years of neglect by the light of a single candle. When they finally trudged back to the manor, Jenny's body ached with exhaustion, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She was going to bring her boys home. She was going to give them Christmas. Even if the Duke of Westcott had banned it from his halls, Jenny Miller would find a way to create joy in her small corner of his vast estate. She had no idea that this simple determination would change everything. The transformation happened in stolen hours and borrowed light. For 3 weeks, Jenny divided herself between 2 worlds. By day, she scrubbed the Duke's marble floors and polished his silver until it gleamed. By night and during every spare moment, she scrubbed her own floors and patched her own walls, turning the gamekeeper's cottage from ruin into something that might, with enough hope and determination, resemble a home. The other servants helped in ways both small and significant. Thomas, the stablemaster, brought her a rickety table that had been destined for firewood and 2 chairs with wobbly legs but solid seats. Mrs. Brennan smuggled out a cast-iron pot with a crack in the bottom that could still hold stew if one was careful. Sarah donated blankets too threadbare for the guest rooms, but perfectly adequate for children who had been sleeping on orphanage cots. Jenny accepted each gift with gratitude that made her voice thick, though she tried to refuse at first. "Nonsense," Mrs. Brennan had said, pressing the pot into Jenny's hands. "What good is a cottage without cookware? Besides, His Grace will never miss it. The man does not even know what is in his own kitchens." On the first Sunday of December, Jenny walked to the parish orphanage with her heart beating so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The building loomed grey and institutional against the winter sky, its windows reflecting nothing but clouds. She had made this walk dozens of times, but today felt different. Today she was not coming just to visit. Today she was bringing her boys home. Mrs. Albright, the orphanage matron, met her in the cold entrance hall. Her expression was skeptical as she listened to Jenny's explanation about the cottage. "Mrs. Miller, I appreciate your determination, but are you certain this accommodation is suitable for children?" The matron's tone suggested she already knew the answer. "It has 4 walls and a roof, ma'am. It has a fireplace. And it has me. That is more than they have here." The words came out sharper than Jenny intended, but she did not apologize. She had seen the orphanage dormitories, rows of narrow beds in rooms that never quite got warm, children who moved in silent lines and spoke in whispers, as if they had learned that taking up space was dangerous. Mrs. Albright's expression softened slightly. "Very well. I will prepare their things." 20 minutes later, Jenny stood in the entrance hall with Daniel on her left and Eli on her right, each boy clutching a small cloth bundle that contained everything he owned in the world. Daniel, at 8, tried to look brave, his chin lifted and his shoulders squared. Eli, only 6, simply stared at her with enormous eyes, as if afraid she might disappear if he looked away. "Come, my loves," Jenny whispered, taking their hands. "We are going home." The walk back to the estate took twice as long as usual. Eli's legs were short, and he tired quickly in the snow. Eventually, Daniel took his brother's bundle so Eli could walk unencumbered, and Jenny marveled at the quiet competence of her older son, this child who had grown up too fast in her absence. When the cottage finally came into view through the bare trees, Jenny held her breath. She had worked so hard to make it presentable, but seeing it through her children's eyes, she suddenly saw only its flaws: the patched roof, the mismatched boards covering the broken window, the way it hunched small and humble against the winter landscape. Daniel broke free of her hand and ran ahead, his boots kicking up snow. He threw open the door and disappeared inside, Eli scrambling after him. Jenny followed more slowly, her heart in her throat. Inside, she found her sons exploring with the wonder of children who had lived in institutional grey for too long. Daniel ran his hands along the scrubbed walls as if testing their solidity. Eli pressed his face against the intact window, leaving a small oval of breath fog on the glass. They opened the door to the tiny bedroom and exclaimed over the 2 narrow beds Jenny had constructed from planks and rope, covered with the donated blankets. "Is this really ours?" Eli asked, his voice small and disbelieving. "Do we get to stay?" Jenny knelt between them, gathering both boys into her arms. "Yes, my darlings. This is ours. We stay together now." Daniel pulled back to look at her face, and she saw tears tracking down his cheeks even as he tried to maintain his brave expression. "I thought," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I thought maybe you had forgotten us." The words hit Jenny like a physical blow. "Oh, my love. Never. Not for one single moment. I have thought of you every day, every hour. Everything I have done has been to bring us back together." They held each other in the center of the small cottage while snow began to fall outside, and Jenny felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the constant anxiety that had gripped her for 2 years. Her boys were home. Whatever hardships lay ahead, they would face them together. That evening they sat around the small fire Jenny had coaxed to life in the newly cleaned fireplace. She had made a simple stew from vegetables Mrs. Brennan had given her, and though it was thin and there was no meat, the boys ate as if it were a feast. After supper, as darkness pressed against the windows and the fire crackled, Eli climbed into Jenny's lap, and Daniel leaned against her shoulder. "Mama," Eli said softly, "will we have Christmas this year?" The question hung in the air. Through the walls came the distant sound of carolers in the village, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. Jenny thought of Westcott Hall, dark and silent, where even the mention of the holiday was forbidden. She thought of the Duke who had lost everything and chosen to live in perpetual winter. But here, in this cottage, she had a choice. Her children had known enough deprivation, enough grey institutional existence. If she could give them nothing else, she could give them the memory of one Christmas together. Yes, she said firmly, we will have Christmas. It will not be grand, my loves. There will be no expensive toys or elaborate feasts. But we will have each other, and we will have joy. And that is what truly matters. Will there be decorations? Daniel asked. At the orphanage, they told us His Grace forbids them. Jenny felt a flash of anger at a man so lost in grief that he would deny children the simple pleasure of greenery and light. This is our home, she said carefully. What we do here is our own concern. If His Grace does not wish to see Christmas in his mansion, that is his choice. But we are not in his mansion. Eli's eyes grew round. Will we get in trouble? No, my darling, we will not. Jenny kissed the top of his head, breathing in the little boy smell of him. We have every right to celebrate in our own way. Can we make decorations? Daniel asked, his voice brightening. Real ones? We can indeed. Jenny thought rapidly, calculating what little money she had saved. We cannot buy anything from the shops, but we can make do with what nature provides. There are pine trees in the forest, we can gather branches, and we can make ornaments from whatever we find. The boys' faces transformed with excitement, and Jenny felt her own heart lift in response. For the first time since Jonathan's death, she felt something beyond mere survival. She felt possibility. They talked late into the night, making plans for their humble Christmas. Daniel suggested they could draw pictures on scraps of paper to hang as decorations. Eli wanted to make angels from whatever materials they could find. Jenny promised that on her next half-day, they would all venture into the forest together to gather evergreen branches. When she finally tucked them into their beds, both boys were smiling. "Mama," Daniel whispered, as she bent to kiss his forehead. "This is the best day I can remember." Jenny's eyes burned with tears, but she smiled through them. "Mine too, my love. Mine too." She returned to the main room and added another small log to the fire, making it last. The cottage was still shabby, still poor, still held together with determination and borrowed items. But it was filled with something Westcott Hall lacked entirely. It was filled with hope. Through the window, she could see the vast dark shape of the manor in the distance, its windows mostly dark except for a few dim lights. Somewhere in that enormous house, the Duke sat alone with his grief and his brandy, convinced that he had successfully murdered Christmas. Jenny did not hate him for his edict. How could she when she understood loss? But she felt a deep sadness for a man who had let sorrow consume him so completely that he could not bear even the sight of joy in others. She whispered a prayer into the firelight, for her boys, for this fragile new beginning, and even for the lonely Duke in his self-imposed prison. Then she banked the fire and went to bed, her heart full of plans for the simple Christmas she would create from nothing but love and stubborn determination. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the estate in white. In the village, carolers made their way from house to house, and in Westcott Hall, George Ashford poured another glass of brandy and tried not to hear the distant sound of voices raised in song. Neither the Duke nor the widow knew that their paths were about to cross in a way that would change both their lives forever. The days before Christmas moved forward with a rhythm that felt almost normal. Jenny woke before dawn, dressed in the dark cottage while her boys slept, and made the walk to Westcott Hall to begin her duties. She returned each evening to find Daniel keeping watch over Eli, the fire carefully tended, the cottage warm and waiting. It was a hard life, but it was theirs. On the morning of December 20th, Jenny woke to find both boys already dressed and waiting by the door, their faces bright with anticipation. "Today is the day, Mama," Daniel announced. "You promised we could go to the forest today." Jenny smiled despite her exhaustion. She had promised, and she would keep that promise even though her body ached from scrubbing floors and her hands were raw from lye soap. Today is indeed the day. "But first I must complete my morning duties at the hall. This afternoon, when I return, We will go together." The boys accepted this with the patience of children who had learned that adults must work, though Eli's face fell slightly. The morning at Westcott Hall passed with agonizing slowness. Jenny moved through the silent corridors, her arms full of fresh linens, her mind already in the forest with her sons. She passed the great hall, where a magnificent Christmas tree should have stood, and saw only empty space. She polished silver in the dining room, where holiday feasts should have been prepared, and found only the Duke's solitary place setting. Sarah found her in the library, dusting books that likely had not been touched in years. "You are humming," Sarah observed with raised eyebrows. "Jenny Miller, are you actually humming while you work?" Jenny had not even realized. She felt her cheeks warm. "My boys and I are going to gather greenery this afternoon. They are so excited." Sarah's expression softened. "You are giving them a proper Christmas despite everything, are you not?" "I am trying." "Good." Sarah glanced around to ensure they were alone, then lowered her voice. "Let the Duke live in his darkness if he chooses. Your children deserve better." The words stayed with Jenny through the rest of her duties. When her work finally ended, she nearly ran back to the cottage, her breath making clouds in the cold air. Daniel and Eli met her at the door, already bundled in their thin coats and the scarves Mrs. Brennan had knitted for them. "We have been ready for hours," Eli announced solemnly. "Then let us not waste another moment." Jenny took their hands, and together they set off toward the small forest that bordered the eastern edge of the estate. The afternoon was bitterly cold, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Their boots crunched through the frozen crust, and their breath hung white in the air. But the boys did not seem to notice the temperature. They ran ahead, circled back, pointed at birds in the bare branches, and filled the silence with questions and observations that made Jenny's heart swell. When they reached the edge of the forest, the world transformed. Pine trees rose dark and fragrant, their branches heavy with snow. The air smelled of resin and winter earth, and everything was hushed and holy. "Can we really take branches?" Eli whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break some spell. "We can take a few small ones." Jenny scanned the trees, looking for lower branches that would not harm the tree's growth. "We must be respectful. We take only what we need, and thank the forest for its gift." Daniel found a fallen branch first, its needles still green and supple. "Mama, look, this one is already on the ground. The forest is giving it to us." Jenny's throat tightened at his earnest face. "That is exactly right, my love." They gathered carefully, a few small pine branches, some sprigs of holly with bright red berries, even a twisted length of ivy that grew along a fallen log. The boys treated each piece as treasure, exclaiming over the color of the berries, the sharpness of the pine needles, the way the ivy curled in perfect spirals. As they worked, snow began to fall again, soft fat flakes that caught in their hair and eyelashes. Eli laughed and tried to catch them on his tongue. Daniel, more serious, helped Jenny bundle their findings together with string she had brought from the cottage. "What shall we make with them?" Daniel asked as they began the walk home. "A wreath for our door," Jenny decided, "so that everyone who passes will know that love lives here." "Even His Grace?" Eli asked, his voice worried. "Will he be angry?" Jenny paused, considering her words carefully. "His Grace has his own pain, my darling. He has forbidden Christmas in his own house because it reminds him of people he loved and lost. But our cottage is not his house. What we hang on our own door is our own choice. But what if he sees it?" "Then perhaps," Jenny said softly, "he will remember that Christmas is not just about loss. Perhaps he will see that it can also be about hope." They reached the cottage as true darkness began to fall. Jenny lit candles, built up the fire, and spread their forest treasures on the table. The cottage filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. "Now," she said, pulling out the chair so both boys could stand and watch. "We weave these together to make something beautiful from simple things." Her hands moved with care, showing them how to overlap the branches, how to twist them together, how to secure them with bits of string and wire. Daniel and Eli helped, their small fingers fumbling but determined. When the ivy would not cooperate, Eli suggested wrapping it around the outside, and his idea worked perfectly. When they needed more color, Daniel remembered the red berries and tucked them carefully between the pine needles. It took 2 hours, but finally the wreath lay complete on the table, a circle of green and red, rough and uneven, held together with visible knots and crooked twists. It was nothing like the perfect holly wreaths that decorated wealthy homes in the village. It looked exactly like what it was, something made by poor hands from free materials, but it was theirs. And it was beautiful. "Mama," Eli breathed, touching it with one finger as if it might break. "We made this." "We did indeed." Jenny felt tears prick her eyes. "Shall we hang it on our door?" The boys nodded enthusiastically, and together they carried the wreath outside. Jenny had saved a nail from the repairs, and she drove it into the wooden door with the handle of a knife, wincing at each loud bang in the quiet evening. When the wreath hung at last, they stood back to admire their work. The pine branches were already beginning to curl from the warmth of the cottage, and the red berries glowed in the candlelight that spilled through the window. "It is the most beautiful wreath in all of England," Daniel declared. Jenny laughed, pulling both boys close. "I believe you may be right," but as she looked at their creation, this imperfect circle made from scraps and love, she felt something shift inside her chest. They had created light in a place of darkness. They had made beauty from almost nothing. They had defied the edict of a grieving duke and claimed their right to joy. She thought of George Ashford in his enormous mansion, surrounded by wealth and luxury, yet living in a poverty of spirit that made their humble cottage seem rich by comparison. "This is our home," she whispered, more to herself than to her sons. "In this house, love and hope have a place even if the whole world has forgotten them." Inside, they celebrated with the last of Mrs. Brennan's tea and pieces of brown bread toasted over the fire. The boys made ornaments from scraps of paper, drawing angels and stars with charcoal from the fireplace. They sang Christmas carols in whispered voices, as if the songs were secrets meant only for them. When Jenny finally tucked them into bed, both boys were smiling, their fingers still marked with charcoal and pine sap. "Mama," Daniel murmured sleepily, "this is what happiness feels like, is it not?" Jenny kissed his forehead, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes, my darling, this is exactly what happiness feels like." She returned to the main room and sat by the fire, her body exhausted but her spirit strangely light. Through the window she could see their wreath hanging on the door, visible even in the darkness. She had no way of knowing that at that very moment, in Westcott Hall, the Duke of Westcott was ordering his horse saddled, driven from his study by restlessness and memories he could not escape. She had no way of knowing that his path would lead him past her cottage. She had no way of knowing that the simple wreath hanging on her door, made of so little and filled with so much, would be the thing that finally cracked the ice around his heart. George could not breathe inside Westcott Hall. The walls pressed close despite the vast rooms, the silence suffocated despite the emptiness. 5 years since Catherine and Thomas died, and December still felt like drowning. He pushed from his desk, the chair scraping loudly. "Saddle Tempest," he ordered when he reached the stables. "Now." Within minutes he rode into the frozen night, urging his black stallion faster through snow-covered grounds. The moon hung bright and full, turning the world silver and blue. George rode without destination, seeking only escape from the memories that haunted every corner of his home. Then he saw it, a point of warm light in the distance, the gamekeeper's cottage. As he drew closer, details emerged. Smoke from the chimney, candlelight in the window, and there, hanging on the rough door, impossible to miss, a wreath, green branches, red berries, unmistakably Christmas. George's hands clenched the reins until the leather creaked. How dare she? He had been clear about his edict. That wreath was defiance, an insult to everything he had forbidden. He dismounted and strode to the door, raising his fist to knock. Inside, he heard children's laughter, high and happy, followed by a woman's soft voice. The sound cut through him. 3 sharp knocks echoed in the night. When the door opened, Jenny Miller stood backlit by firelight, her face shifting from curiosity to shock. "Your Grace," she breathed, dropping into a curtsy. "I did not expect—" "The wreath," George interrupted coldly. "Explain it." Behind her, two small faces peered out, frightened eyes watching. Jenny stepped outside quickly, pulling the door partly closed. "Boys, go back inside," she said gently but firmly. She turned to face him, trembling in her thin dress, arms wrapped against the cold. "Your Grace, I apologize if it offends you, but this is our home. My sons and I have the right to observe Christmas within our own walls." The audacity struck him silent. She was a servant, living by his permission, yet she stood unbowed, defending pine branches as if they mattered. "I made my position clear," George said. "No Christmas on this estate. In your house, yes." Her chin lifted. "But this cottage is where my children live. What we hang on our door is our concern. Everything here is my concern. Then perhaps you should not have given us leave." Her voice cracked with emotion. "My sons have known nothing but hardship for 2 years. If I can give them one symbol of hope, I will, even if it displeases you." In the moonlight, her face showed both fragility and fierce determination. Before George could respond, the door opened again. Both children stepped out, positioning themselves beside their mother, small hands clutching her skirt. "Sir," the older boy said bravely, "please do not take our wreath. We made it ourselves. We only took fallen branches." The younger one looked up with enormous eyes. "Are you going to make Mama sad? She has been sad so much already." Something cracked in George's chest, ice breaking on a frozen pond. He looked at the three of them, the widow in her thin dress, the children in patched coats, all defending a wreath made of scraps. They had nothing, yet they fought for their right to hope, to celebrate, to find joy in pine branches. When had he last fought for anything but his right to stay numb? "May I see it?" The words escaped before he considered them. The wreath. "May I see it closely?" Jenny lifted it from the nail, handling it like something precious. George took it with suddenly clumsy hands. Up close, every imperfection showed. Uneven branches, visible knots, bits of wire poking through, berries already shriveling. It was the most honest thing he had seen in 5 years. He pictured them making it, gathered around a rough table by candlelight, weaving branches with cold fingers, laughing over mistakes, creating beauty from almost nothing. "This is the bravest wreath I have ever seen," George said quietly. Jenny's expression shifted from defensive to uncertain. "Your Grace?" He returned it to her hands. "Hang it higher, so anyone passing will see it." He turned to leave, but the older boy's voice stopped him. "Sir, do you have enough wood for your fires?" George frowned at the odd question. "I have abundant wood." "Oh." The boy looked disappointed. "Mama said we must always ask if people have what they need in winter, because it is kind." George's throat tightened. "That is thoughtful of you." "Do you have enough wood, Mama?" the younger boy asked. "For tonight." "We will manage," Jenny said, but George heard the hesitation. "We always do." "How much wood do you have?" George demanded. Her cheeks colored. "Enough for tonight, Your Grace." "Tomorrow? How much?" "2 logs, sir. Perhaps 3 small ones. But truly we will be fine." She had 2 logs for the night in a cottage with gaps in the walls. Her children wore coats so thin he could see their breath. And she had spent the afternoon gathering pine branches instead of firewood, because hope mattered more than warmth. When had he stopped understanding that? "If the wreath troubles you," Jenny said hesitantly, "I can move it inside. I do not wish to cause you pain." He met her eyes and saw genuine compassion, not pity, but simple human kindness. This woman had every reason to resent him, yet she cared about his pain. "No," he said hoarsely. "Keep it exactly where it is." He mounted Tempest swiftly, desperate to escape before something broke inside him. But he looked back once more at the cottage, at the wreath hanging crooked on the rough door, lit by the glow within. When he reached the manor, he went directly to find Pemberton. "Tomorrow morning send 3 cartloads to the cottage, firewood enough for winter, provisions, whatever Mrs. Brennan recommends, and blankets, warm clothing for 2 boys, and—" He paused. "Christmas decorations, real ones. Glass ornaments, a gold star. Leave them quietly with a note." Pemberton's eyes widened. Your Grace, and begin preparations for a Christmas Eve supper for the staff. Those without family should not be alone. George climbed to his chambers, feeling strangely lighter as if he had set down a long-carried weight. He did not reach for brandy. Instead, he stood at his window, looking toward the eastern edge of his estate, where a cottage glowed like a small star. Somewhere in that cottage, a widow added her last log to the fire and pulled her children close. Somewhere in that cottage, a wreath made of scraps insisted that hope had a right to exist. George pressed his palm against the cold glass and whispered words that surprised him. Thank you. If you have enjoyed this story so far, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you these heartfelt stories. Now let us continue with the rest of this tale. Jenny woke to the sound of wheels crunching through snow. For a moment, still caught in the fog of sleep, she thought she was dreaming. Then Daniel's voice cut through the morning quiet, high and excited from the other room. "Mama! Mama, come quick! There are wagons outside!" Jenny threw off the thin blanket and rushed to the window, her breath catching. 3 large carts stood in the snow before the cottage, their beds piled high with goods. 2 men she recognized from the estate were already unloading, stacking firewood with efficient movements, while a third carried sacks toward the door. Her hands flew to her mouth. "Boys, stay inside," she ordered, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders and stepping into the freezing morning air. Her bare feet sank into snow that bit like teeth, but she barely noticed. "Mrs. Miller," one of the men said, touching his cap respectfully, "His Grace has sent provisions. We are to unload and be on our way." "But I—" Jenny's voice failed. She watched, stunned, as they worked. The first cart held firewood, not scraps, but properly cut logs that would burn clean and long. The second carried sacks of flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, even a small ham wrapped in cloth. The third held blankets, thick wool blankets that looked new, and a wooden crate marked with careful lettering. "'Cause there's some mistake," Jenny finally managed. "Surely His Grace meant this for someone else." "No mistake, ma'am." The man pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "There is a note." Jenny took it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was strong and masculine, each letter formed with precision. "For the tree most valiant, so it may have the adornments it deserves. G.W." Her eyes burned with sudden tears. She pressed the note to her chest, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of it, the acknowledgement that her small acts of courage had been seen. The tree most valiant. He meant the wreath. He meant them. By the time the men finished unloading, the cottage looked transformed. Firewood stood stacked against the outer wall, enough to last through the harshest winter. The provisions filled every available shelf inside. And the crate, when Jenny finally opened it with shaking hands, revealed treasures that made both boys gasp with wonder. Glass ornaments in red and gold and silver, each one catching the morning light like captured stars. Ribbons in green velvet, candles in brass holders, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a golden star that gleamed as if it held its own sun. "Mama," Eli whispered, touching one ornament with a single careful finger. "Are these really for us?" "They are, my darling." Jenny's voice broke. "They are a gift from His Grace." Daniel lifted the star reverently. "He remembered," he said softly. "We told him about wanting to make our tree special, and he remembered." Jenny sank into one of the rickety chairs, suddenly unable to stand. The Duke who had confronted them so coldly last night, who had stood rigid with anger at the sight of their humble wreath, that same man had done this. He had seen their poverty, and responded not with pity but with quiet generosity that preserved their dignity. She thought of his face in the moonlight when he had held their wreath, the way something had shifted in his expression. She thought of his words, "This is the bravest wreath I have ever seen." He understood. Somehow, beneath all his grief and isolation, George Ashford understood what it meant to create joy from nothing, to insist on hope when the world offered only darkness. The day passed in a blur of wonder. The boys arranged and rearranged the ornaments, debating the perfect placement for each one. Jenny made a proper stew with the ham and vegetables, and the cottage filled with smells of comfort and plenty. They hung the ribbons around the window, and suddenly their small space looked festive, warm, alive. That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep with smiles on their faces, Jenny stood at the window looking toward Westcott Hall. Lights glowed in some windows now, more than she had seen in all her time working there. Something was changing in that great house, just as something was changing in her heart. She touched the note that she had tucked into her apron pocket, tracing the initials with her fingertip. G.W. George Westcott, a man who had lost everything yet somehow found the grace to give to those who had nothing. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, hoping somehow the words would reach him. 3 days before Christmas, Jenny returned to work at the manor. The change was immediately apparent. Garlands had appeared in the entrance hall, small, tasteful, but present. The servants moved with lighter steps, whispered about the upcoming Christmas Eve supper His Grace had ordered. Mrs. Brennan pulled Jenny aside in the kitchen. "His Grace has been different these past days," the cook said quietly, less withdrawn. "He actually smiled at young Thomas yesterday." Smiled. "I nearly dropped the soup tureen." Jenny felt warmth spread through her chest but said nothing. She went about her duties with careful attention, polishing silver in the dining room, sweeping the library, laying fresh linens in unused guest chambers. She did not expect to see the Duke. Men like him did not cross paths with women like her in the normal course of a day. But late in the afternoon, as she was leaving the library with an armful of old newspapers, she nearly collided with him in the doorway. "Your Grace." She dropped into a curtsy immediately, papers scattering around her feet. "Forgive me, I did not hear you approaching. The fault is mine." George knelt to help gather the papers, and Jenny froze, mortified that a duke was picking up after her clumsiness. "Please, Your Grace, allow me." Their hands touched as they both reached for the same paper. The contact lasted only a second, but Jenny felt it like a spark traveling up her arm. She looked up and found him watching her, his grey eyes intense and unreadable. "Mrs. Miller," he said quietly, "I trust the provisions were adequate." "More than adequate, Your Grace." Jenny's voice came out barely above a whisper. "They were generous beyond measure." She swallowed hard. "Thank you seems insufficient, but I do not have better words. You needed firewood." His jaw tightened slightly. "I should have ensured you had it from the beginning. You have given us more than we dreamed possible. The note," her voice caught, "calling us valiant. It meant more than you can know." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or vulnerability quickly masked. I only spoke the truth. They stood in the doorway, papers forgotten in their hands, the air between them charged with something neither could name. Jenny was acutely aware of how close he stood, of the warmth radiating from him, of the way his eyes held hers, as if searching for something. "Your sons," George said finally. "Are they well?" "They are thriving, Your Grace. They speak of your kindness daily." Jenny managed a small smile. "Daniel said you must be magic to know exactly what would make our tree beautiful." George's expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face. "I would like to see it," he said, almost hesitantly. "Your tree, if that would not be an intrusion." Jenny's heart hammered against her ribs. "You would be most welcome, Your Grace. The boys would be honored. Tomorrow afternoon. I could call when your duties are complete. Tomorrow afternoon would be perfect." They stood a moment longer, neither quite willing to break the connection. Then George stepped back, allowing her to pass, and Jenny moved into the corridor on unsteady legs. She did not see the way he watched her walk away, or how his hand rose unconsciously to touch the doorframe where hers had rested moments before. That night, Jenny could not sleep. She lay in the darkness listening to her son's soft breathing, her mind spinning with anticipation and confusion. The Duke was coming to her cottage, not in anger this time, but by invitation, to see their tree, to visit with her children, to enter their small world by choice. She thought of his eyes in the library, the intensity in them, the way her skin had tingled where their hands touched. She thought of his voice when he spoke of her sons, gentle in a way that made her chest ache. This was dangerous. He was a duke, and she was a widowed servant. Whatever she was beginning to feel, this warmth that spread through her when she thought of him, this awareness that made her pulse race, it could lead nowhere good. But even as she told herself this, even as she listed all the reasons why she should maintain proper distance, her heart refused to listen. Because beneath the titles and the vast difference in their stations, she had seen something in George Ashford that called to something in her. She had seen loneliness that matched her own. She had seen grief that he carried as she carried hers. She had seen a man who had forgotten how to hope, and she recognized him because she had been that person too, until her boys reminded her that life was still worth living. Tomorrow, he would come to her cottage. And Jenny knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that when he did, something irrevocable would shift between them. She pressed her hand to her racing heart and whispered into the darkness words she barely dared acknowledge. "I am beginning to care for him." And God help her, she suspected he might be beginning to care for her too. The afternoon sun hung low and pale when George arrived at the cottage on foot. He had left his horse at the stable, choosing to walk the half-mile through snow-covered grounds. Somehow riding seemed too formal, too much a reminder of the distance between who he was and where he was going. He paused at the edge of the small clearing, studying the cottage in daylight. Smoke curled from the chimney. The wreath still hung on the door, joined now by a green ribbon that fluttered in the breeze. Through the window he could see warm light and movement, a glimpse of domesticity that made something in his chest tighten. Before he could knock, the door flew open, and both boys tumbled out, their faces bright with excitement. "Your Grace!" Daniel executed an awkward bow that might have been charming or comical. George could not decide which. "We have been watching for you all afternoon." Eli grabbed his hand with the unself-conscious trust of a child who had decided someone was safe. "Come see our tree. It is the most beautiful tree in all of England because of your presence." George allowed himself to be pulled forward, and Jenny appeared in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from the fire or perhaps from something else. She had removed her apron and tidied her hair, and she looked lovely in a way that made his breath catch. "Your Grace," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with an expression that held both welcome and uncertainty. "Please, come in." He had to duck slightly to enter. The cottage was built for smaller men, or for people whose lives had taught them to make themselves small. Inside, the warmth enveloped him immediately, along with the sense of pine and wood smoke and something baking. The space was tiny. The entire cottage would fit inside his study with room to spare. But it was clean and filled with an atmosphere his vast manor had lost years ago. It felt lived in. It felt like home. There. Eli pointed proudly to the corner where a small evergreen branch stood upright in a pot, its sparse needles now decorated with the ornaments George had sent. The glass balls caught the firelight, sending rainbow colors dancing across the rough walls. The golden star perched at the top, slightly crooked but glowing. "We put your star at the very top," Daniel said seriously, "because it is the finest thing we own." George moved closer, genuinely affected by what he saw. They had used every ornament, arranging them with careful attention despite having no experience with such things. The velvet ribbons were woven through the branches. The brass candle holders waited for their candles, ready for Christmas Eve. "It is magnificent," he said, and meant it. "I have seen trees in palaces that were not half so beautiful." The boys beamed, and Jenny's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Will you take tea, Your Grace?" Her voice was steady despite the emotion in her face. "It is nothing fine, but it is warm. I would be honored." She busied herself at the small hearth, and George lowered himself carefully into one of the chairs at the rough table. Daniel and Eli sat on either side of him, chattering about the decorations, about Christmas plans, about the snow fort they were building behind the cottage. George found himself listening with genuine interest, asking questions, even laughing when Eli described how Daniel had accidentally sat on a holly branch. When had he last laughed? The sound felt rusty but good, like a door opening after years of being sealed. Jenny brought tea in mismatched cups, her fingers brushing his as she set one before him. The touch was brief but deliberate, and their eyes met over the steam rising from the cups. George saw awareness there, attraction she was trying to hide, and knew she must see the same in his gaze. "This is lovely," he said, "meaning more than the tea. Your home, what you have created here. We have very little." Jenny sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "But what we have together, that makes it everything." The simple truth of her words struck him. He had everything: wealth, title, lands, a house filled with treasures, and none of it had brought him comfort or peace. She had nothing, and yet this cottage held more warmth than Westcott Hall had known in 5 years. "May I ask you something?" George heard himself say. "How do you do it? How do you continue to find joy after loss?" Jenny was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "When Jonathan died, I thought I would drown in grief. I could not breathe for the weight of it. But then I looked at my sons and I realized they were still here, still needing me, still capable of wonder and laughter." She met his eyes. "I had a choice. I could let sorrow consume everything, or I could choose to see the light that remained. It is not always easy. Some days the darkness still wins. But I keep choosing every morning to hope, even when hope seems foolish, especially then." Her smile was sad but genuine. "Because what is the alternative, Your Grace? To exist without hope is not truly living." George felt something crack inside him, a wall he had built so carefully beginning to crumble. "You are braver than I am, Mrs. Miller. I do not know about that." Jenny's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I think perhaps we are both just trying to survive our grief in the ways we know how. You by holding the world at a distance, me by pulling my children close. Which way is better? I cannot say. But I know which way is lonelier." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. George realized the boys had grown quiet, had slipped away to the other room to play with something they had found. He and Jenny sat alone at the small table, the fire crackling, the afternoon light fading toward evening. "I envy you," he said quietly. "Not your poverty, but your capacity to still feel deeply, to still believe in joy. I thought I had killed that in myself." Jenny reached across the table, her hand covering his. The gesture was bold for a servant to make toward a duke, but they had moved beyond such boundaries without either quite noticing. "You have not killed it, Your Grace." Her thumb brushed across his knuckles, sending heat up his arm. "If you had, you would not have sent firewood to a widow and her sons. You would not be sitting in this cottage drinking tea from chipped cups. You would not have called our Wreath brave." George turned his hand over, capturing hers, his fingers threading through hers. Her hand was rough from work, the nails short and practical, but it felt perfect in his grasp. "I have not been able to stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice rough. "Since that night when I saw your wreath, you have been in every thought, the way you stood there defending it, the way you created light in darkness, the way you look at your children with such fierce love." "I cannot stop." He broke off, realizing he was saying too much, revealing too much, but Jenny did not pull away. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her free hand rising to rest against his cheek. "I think of you too," she whispered. "More than I should, more than is wise." Their faces were close now, close enough that George could see golden flecks in her brown eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that crossing this line would complicate everything, but he could not bring himself to care. "Jenny," he breathed, and her name on his lips felt like a prayer. "George," she answered, dropping his title, speaking to him as a man rather than a duke. The distance between them disappeared. George did not know who moved first. Perhaps they both did. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a question asked and answered. The kiss was gentle and searching, full of wonder and hesitation, and the recognition that something profound was shifting between them. When they pulled back, both were breathing hard. Jenny's hand remained against his face, and George covered it with his own, holding her palm to his cheek. "This is madness," she whispered. "Perhaps." George turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "But I find I do not care." From the other room came the sound of the boys playing, their voices a reminder of reality. Jenny drew back slightly, though she did not let go of his hand. "Your Grace." "George." She smiled despite the tears now sliding down her cheeks. "George, this cannot be simple. You are a duke. I am a servant. The world will not understand. Then we will teach it to understand." The words came out with more certainty than George had felt about anything in years. "I do not know how yet. I do not know what shape this takes, but I know I cannot walk away from this from you." The boys chose that moment to return, Daniel carrying a wooden horse Thomas had carved for them, Eli dragging a blanket he wanted to show their guest. They did not notice the charged atmosphere, the tear tracks on their mother's face, the way the Duke held her hand as if it was something precious. George stayed until the sun set fully, playing simple games with the boys, helping Daniel practice his letters, listening to Eli's earnest explanations of how snow was made. He felt lighter than he had in years, as if some crushing weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When he finally stood to leave, Jenny walked him to the door while the boys prepared for bed. They stood close in the small entry, neither willing to step back. "Come to the manor on Christmas Eve," George said quietly. "You and the boys. There will be a supper for the staff. I want you there. We will come." He reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her neck. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, and Jenny's eyes fluttered closed at the touch. "I must go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "I know." "Jenny." "Yes?" "Thank you for letting me in." She opened her eyes, and in them he saw everything he felt reflected back. Desire, fear, hope, wonder. "Thank you for seeing us, for seeing me." One more kiss, soft and promising, and then George forced himself to step out into the cold night. He walked back toward the manor, turning every few steps to look back at the cottage with its wreath and its warm light, and the woman who had somehow reached past his defenses, and reminded him what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival. Behind him, Jenny stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared into the darkness, her fingers pressed to her lips, her heart full of equal parts joy and terror. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in fresh snow and anticipation. Jenny woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves that had nothing to do with the holiday and everything to do with the evening ahead. She would see George tonight. At the manor. Among others, yes, but she would see him, and after what had passed between them in the cottage 3 days ago, everything felt different. A small package had arrived yesterday, delivered by a blushing maid who said only that His Grace had sent it. Inside, Jenny had found a dress, simple but beautiful, in deep forest green with delicate embroidery at the collar. The fabric was finer than anything she had ever worn. Tucked beneath it were 2 small jackets for the boys, warm wool in deep blue with brass buttons that would make them look like little gentlemen. She had cried holding that dress, understanding what it meant. George was not hiding her. He was not ashamed. He wanted her to feel beautiful when she entered his home. Now, as afternoon faded toward evening, Jenny dressed with trembling hands. The green fabric whispered against her skin as she pulled it on. It fit perfectly, hugging her waist before falling in soft folds to her ankles. She had never owned anything so fine. Sarah had come to help with her hair, weaving it into a simple but elegant arrangement that left soft tendrils framing her face. When Jenny looked in the small mirror, she barely recognized herself. "You look like a lady," Sarah whispered. "A proper lady. I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I am not." Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "You are exactly who you are. And that is someone worthy of wearing that dress." The boys scrubbed up beautifully in their new jackets, their hair combed smooth, their faces shining with excitement. When the carriage George had sent arrived, they climbed in with reverent care, touching the velvet seats with wonder. Westcott Hall blazed with light. Every window glowed golden, and as they approached, Jenny could hear music, a violin playing softly, voices raised in conversation and laughter. The great house that had been so silent and dark for years had come alive. A footman handed her down from the carriage, and Jenny stood for a moment at the entrance, her sons flanking her, all 3 of them suddenly nervous. Then George appeared at the top of the steps. He wore formal evening clothes, black coat and crisp white shirt, his dark hair combed back from his face. But it was his expression that stole Jenny's breath, the way his eyes found hers immediately, the way his entire face transformed when he saw her in the green dress. He descended the steps and stopped before her, seeming to forget for a moment that they had an audience of servants and staff. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice low and rough. "You look—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "You are beautiful." Jenny felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you, Your Grace, and thank you for the dress." "It is far too generous. It is exactly right." George's eyes held hers for a long moment before he turned to the boys. "And you two look very handsome indeed. Are you ready for a proper Christmas feast?" "Yes, sir," they chorused, and George laughed, a sound that made several servants turn in surprise. The dining hall had been transformed. Long tables were set with white linens and evergreen garlands. Candles blazed in silver holders. The staff gathered there, cooks, maids, stable hands, gardeners, all dressed in their finest, all looking slightly amazed to be dining in a room usually reserved for nobility. George seated Jenny at his right hand, a position of honor that did not go unnoticed. The boys sat across from them, eyes wide at the array of dishes being brought out: roasted goose and ham, potatoes with butter, vegetables in cream sauce, fresh bread still steaming, and pies filled with fruit and spices. The meal was filled with laughter and conversation. George was attentive to everyone, asking after families, remembering names, ensuring that glasses stayed filled and plates stayed full. But his attention returned again and again to Jenny, and each time their eyes met, she felt that spark of connection, that pull that made her aware of every breath. Under the table, his leg pressed against hers, a contact that might have been accidental, except that neither moved away. Jenny felt the heat of him through the layers of fabric, felt her pulse quicken at the simple intimacy of it. When he passed her the wine, his fingers lingered on hers. When he reached for bread, his shoulder brushed hers. Every touch was deliberate, communicating what could not be spoken aloud in this room full of people. After the meal, someone produced a violin, and dancing began in the cleared space at the end of the hall. Jenny watched, content to sit and observe, but George rose and offered his hand. "Would you honor me with a dance, Mrs. Miller?" Every person in the room turned to look. Jenny felt the weight of their stares, heard the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Brennan. A duke did not dance with servants, but George stood with his hand extended, his eyes asking her to trust him, to be brave. Jenny placed her hand in his. "I do not know the steps very well, Your Grace. Then I will teach you." His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "Just follow my lead." He guided her to the center of the floor, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. The violin began a simple waltz, and George moved them into the dance with easy grace. Jenny stumbled at first, but he held her steady, murmuring quiet instructions until she found the rhythm. "There," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "You are dancing, thanks to you." They moved together, and the room seemed to fade. Jenny was aware only of his hand at her waist, burning through the fabric of her dress, of his thumb tracing small circles against her palm, of how close they stood, proper but charged with everything unspoken. "I have thought of nothing but you for 3 days," George whispered, his lips nearly brushing her temple. "Of holding you, kissing you. I can barely breathe when you are near." Jenny's breath hitched. "George, we are being watched. I do not care." His hand tightened at her waist, pulling her infinitesimally closer. "Let them watch. Let them see that you matter to me." The song ended too soon. They separated, both breathing harder than the simple dance warranted. George bowed, Jenny curtsied, and they returned to their seats amid whispers and speculative glances. The evening continued with carols and stories, but Jenny felt George's presence beside her like a living flame. Every time he leaned close to speak to her, every accidental brush of shoulders or hands sent heat coursing through her body. The boys, exhausted from excitement and rich food, began to nod off. A kind maid offered to settle them in a small sitting room with blankets and pillows, and Jenny agreed gratefully, knowing they would be safe and warm. "Come walk with me," George said quietly as the party began to wind down. "I want to show you something." Jenny should have refused. Should have remembered propriety and boundaries and the impossibility of what was happening between them. But she took his offered arm and let him guide her from the dining hall, down a corridor and into a gallery, lit only by moonlight streaming through tall windows. Snow fell outside, visible through the glass, and the world beyond seemed silent and still. George led her to a window that overlooked the eastern edge of the estate, where a small cottage glowed faintly in the distance. "From here I can see your home," he said softly. "Every night since you hung that wreath I have stood at my window and looked toward your light." It became a kind of anchor, a reminder that hope still exists somewhere in the world. Jenny turned to face him, her back against the cold window glass. "And now I do not want to look at your light from a distance." His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking along her cheekbones. "Now I want to be the one creating light with you." He kissed her then, deeper than before, with none of the tentativeness of their first kiss. This was hungry and desperate, a claiming and a surrender all at once. Jenny's hands fisted in his coat, pulling him closer, and George groaned softly against her mouth. His lips moved to her jaw, her neck trailing fire across her skin. Jenny gasped, her head falling back against the window, her fingers sliding into his hair. She felt his hands at her waist, spanning her ribs, thumbs brushing the underside of her breasts through the fabric of her dress. "George," she whispered, though whether in protest or encouragement she could not say. "Tell me to stop," he breathed against her throat. "If you want me to stop, tell me now, because I am losing the ability to think clearly. I do not want you to stop." The words escaped before she could consider them. What do you want, Jenny?" His hands slid around to her back, fingers finding the fastenings of her dress. "Tell me what you want." "You." Her voice broke on the word. "I want you. Come with me." George took her hand and led her quickly through corridors she barely registered, up a staircase, down another hall, until they reached a door he unlocked with shaking hands. His private chambers, warm and masculine, dominated by a large bed and a fireplace where embers still glowed. He locked the door behind them and turned to face her, his chest heaving. "If we do this, everything changes," he said. "I need you to understand that. I do not think of you as a casual dalliance. This means something to me. You mean something to me." Jenny crossed the space between them and took his face in her hands. "Then show me. Show me what I mean to you." What followed was both tender and fierce. George undressed her slowly, his hands reverent as each piece of clothing fell away, his lips following the path his fingers traced. Jenny trembled under his touch, her own hands exploring the hard planes of his chest when she pushed his coat and shirt aside. They came together on his bed in a tangle of limbs and whispered words, skin against skin, breath mingling as they learned each other's bodies with gentle urgency. George touched her as if she were precious, as if he had never been given anything so valuable to hold. Jenny clung to him, tears streaming down her face as pleasure and emotion overwhelmed her in equal measure. He moved inside her with careful intensity, watching her face, whispering her name like a prayer. Their joining was both carnal and sacred, bodies expressing what words could not quite capture, longing and need, and the desperate desire to be known completely. When they finally lay spent and tangled together, George pulled the blankets over them and gathered Jenny close against his chest. Her head rested over his heart, feeling its steady beat, and his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Stay," he whispered into her hair. "Stay here with me tonight. The boys are sleeping soundly and well cared for. Stay, Jenny. I need you beside me." She should have refused. Should have thought of propriety and servants who might notice, and all the complications this would bring. But she was warm and satisfied, and held by a man who had somehow become essential to her in just a few short weeks. "Yes," she whispered. "I will stay." They dozed and woke and made love again, slower this time, learning each other's rhythms and preferences. In the quiet hours before dawn, they talked in whispers, about loss and hope, about dreams and fears, about what might be possible if they were brave enough to reach for it. As the first grey light began to seep through the windows, George kissed her forehead and tightened his arms around her. "Merry Christmas, Jenny," she smiled against his chest. "Merry Christmas, George." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the estate in white. And in the Duke of Westcott's bed, two people who had been certain they would never feel complete again held each other and dared to believe in new beginnings. Jenny woke to pale morning light and the terrifying realization of what she had done. She lay in George's arms, his chest rising and falling with deep sleep, his face peaceful in a way she had never seen it. One of his hands rested on her hip possessively even in slumber, and the weight of it, the intimacy of it, made panic claw at her throat. What had she been thinking? She was a servant, a widow with 2 children and nothing to her name, and she had spent the night in the Duke of Westcott's bed, had given herself to him completely, had whispered promises in the dark that the morning light now revealed as impossible. The reality crashed over her like cold water. Society would never accept this. She would be labeled his mistress, a woman who used her body to gain favor. Her sons would be tainted by association, whispered about, shut out from any chance at respectable futures. And George, what had he been thinking? In the heat of attraction, in the emotion of the moment, perhaps he had convinced himself this could work. But when the passion faded, when he faced the judgment of his peers and the expectations of his class, would he still want the scandal of a relationship with a servant, or worse? What if this was all he wanted? One night, a temporary comfort, and then back to the proper distance between Duke and Maid. The thought made her feel sick. Moving carefully so as not to wake him, Jenny slipped from the bed. Her green dress lay pooled on the floor, and she dressed quickly with shaking hands, fumbling with fastenings George had undone so tenderly just hours before. She needed to get back to her sons, needed to think, needed to escape before George woke, and she had to face what they had done. She was at the door when his voice stopped her. Jenny. Rough with sleep, confused. "Where are you going?" She turned to find him sitting up, sheet pulled at his waist, his dark hair disheveled, and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He looked beautiful and vulnerable, and her heart cracked at the sight. "I must return to my sons." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "It is Christmas morning, they will be waking soon." George swung his legs out of bed, reaching for his discarded trousers. "Then I will come with you. We can—" "No." The word came out too sharp, and she saw him flinch. "Your Grace, I—" She stopped, the title feeling wrong on her tongue after the intimacy they had shared, but also necessary, a reminder of the gulf between them. "Your Grace." George's expression shifted from sleepy contentment to wariness. "Why are you suddenly formal again?" "Because that is what we are," she said quietly. "You are a duke. I am a servant in your household. Last night was what?" He moved toward her, and she held up a hand to stop him. "Please do not come closer." "I cannot think when you are close." George stopped, but his jaw tightened. "Then tell me what you are thinking now." Jenny forced herself to meet his eyes. "I am thinking that in the light of day, last night seems like madness. I am thinking about what people will say, how they will look at my sons, what this means for their futures. I am thinking that I cannot be your mistress, George. I will not be the woman you visit when it suits you and dismiss when society demands it." "Is that what you think last night was?" His voice was low and dangerous. "You think I seduced you for a casual affair. What else can it be?" Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You are a duke. You will need to marry someone appropriate, someone of your class who can give you legitimate heirs and move in your circles. I am a pleasant diversion, perhaps, but I am not—" "Do not finish that sentence." George's hands clenched at his sides. "Do not you dare diminish what we shared by calling it a diversion. Then what do you call it? Tell me, Your Grace, what happens now? Do I return to scrubbing your floors while warming your bed at night? Do my sons grow up knowing their mother is the Duke's mistress? Do you eventually tire of me and find someone new while I—" "Stop!" George crossed the space between them in 3 strides, taking her shoulders in his hands. "Listen to me. I am only going to say this once. Last night was not a mistake. It was not a whim. It was not the beginning of some sordid affair. It was the moment I stopped being afraid and admitted what my heart has known for weeks." Jenny stared at him, afraid to hope, afraid to believe. "I love you," George said, his voice fierce and certain. I love your courage, your kindness, the way you fight for your children, the way you created light in the darkest place. I love the sound of your laugh and the strength in your hands, and the way you look at me as if I am a man rather than a title. And I do not want one night with you. I want every night. I want every morning. I want to be there when your sons wake on Christmas and every day after. Her breath caught. George, marry me. The words came out raw and desperate. Not because of last night, not to preserve your reputation, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Marry me and be my Duchess. Let me be a father to Daniel and Eli. Let us build something together. A real family, a real home, not the mausoleum I have been living in. Jenny felt tears spill over despite her best efforts. You do not know what you are asking. The scandal, I do not care about scandal. Your peers can go to hell if they cannot accept my choice. His hands came up to cup her face, thumbs wiping away her tears. Jenny, I have spent 5 years caring about what I should do, what is expected, what is proper, and it brought me nothing but emptiness. You brought me back to life. Your humble wreath and your fierce heart and your determination to hope even when hope seemed foolish. You saved me. Let me choose you, let me choose us. What if you regret it? Her voice broke. What if someday you wake up and realize you have tied yourself to a woman beneath your station and you resent me for it? Then I will spend every day of my life proving to you that could never happen. George pressed his forehead to hers. I know this is frightening. I know there will be challenges, but I also know that I would rather face those challenges with you by my side than spend another day living half a life without you. Jenny closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence. She thought of her cottage with its crooked wreath, of her sons who deserved a father, of the lonely duke who had become the man she loved. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. George pulled back to look at her, hope and disbelief warring on his face. Say it again. Yes. She laughed through her tears. Yes, George, I will marry you. He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and when he finally pulled back, he was smiling wider than she had ever seen. Wait here. He moved to his desk and pulled out a small box from a locked drawer. My mother's ring. I have been carrying it with me for days, hoping I would find the courage to ask. The ring was beautiful, a simple gold band with a single sapphire that caught the morning light. George slipped it onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. A soft knock at the door made them both freeze. Your Grace? Pemberton's voice carefully neutral. The young masters are awake and asking for their mother. George and Jenny looked at each other, suddenly realizing what they needed to do next. Send them up, George called. And Pemberton? Ask them if they would grant me a moment of their time. There is something important I wish to ask them. Very good, Your Grace. Minutes later, Daniel and Eli burst through the door, still in their clothes from yesterday, hair mussed from sleep. They stopped short when they saw their mother and the Duke standing together, Jenny's eyes red from crying. Mama, are you hurt? Daniel asked, immediately protective. No, my darling. Jenny knelt to their level. I am not hurt, but His Grace, George, has something he wishes to ask you both. Will you listen? George knelt as well, bringing himself eye to eye with the boys. Daniel, Eli, I have asked your mother to marry me, and she has said yes. But before we move forward, I need to ask you both something important. Both boys' eyes went wide. Would you permit me to be your father? George's voice was gentle but serious. I cannot replace the father you lost. I would never try. But I would like to stand as a father to you, to care for you, and guide you, and love you as my own sons. Would you allow that? Eli launched himself at George without hesitation, small arms wrapping around the Duke's neck. Yes, Papa George. Daniel was more cautious, studying George with serious eyes. You will not leave. You will not go away like our real papa did. George's expression cracked with emotion. I will not leave, I promise you, on everything I hold sacred. I will be here for you and your mother for the rest of my days. Daniel looked at his mother, and Jenny nodded, tears streaming freely now. Only then did he step forward and offer George his hand. Then yes, sir. You may be our father. George pulled both boys into his arms, and Jenny wrapped her arms around all three of them. This makeshift family born of loss and hope, and the courage to love again. When they finally pulled apart, Eli looked up at George with sudden realization. "Does this mean we get to live in the big house?" George laughed, the sound full and joyous. "It means this is your house now. All of it. Every room, every corridor, every bit of it is yours. Even the library with all the books? Especially the library." The boys whooped with excitement, and Jenny felt something settle in her chest. Peace mixed with joy, terror mixed with hope. This was real. This was happening. Against all odds and expectations, she was going to marry the Duke of Westcott, and her sons would have a father again. George stood and pulled Jenny to him, kissing her forehead softly, while the boys explored the room with newfound ownership. His arms around her felt like home, like safety, like all the Christmases to come. "Merry Christmas, my love," he whispered. "The first of many." Jenny smiled up at him, her hand with its new ring resting over his heart. "The first of many," she agreed. "And everyone will be filled with hope." 6 months had passed since that Christmas morning when everything changed. Spring had come to Westcott Hall, bringing with it blossoms and birdsong and a transformation that went far deeper than the changing seasons. The great house that had been a mausoleum for 5 years now rang with life. Children's laughter echoing through corridors, music drifting from open windows, the scent of fresh flowers in every room. The wedding had taken place in the small chapel on the estate grounds, on a mild day in February. Jenny had worn white silk that whispered when she moved, her hair crowned with early snowdrops. Daniel and Eli had stood proud as ring-bearers, their new suits making them look older than their years. And George had wept openly when Jenny walked down the aisle, not caring who saw his tears or what they might think. The villagers had come, along with the estate staff and a surprising number of George's peers, who, contrary to Jenny's fears, had seemed more curious than scandalized. A few had even told George privately that they admired his courage to marry for love rather than obligation. That evening, Jenny Miller had become the Duchess of Westcott, and her sons had become the Duke's heirs. Now, on a warm spring afternoon, Jenny stood in what had become her favorite room, the small parlor overlooking the eastern gardens where she could see the cottage in the distance. She often came here when she needed a moment to herself, to remember where she had come from and marvel at where she now stood. "Mama," Eli's voice called from somewhere deep in the house. "Papa says we can ride to the village if you say yes." Jenny smiled. The boys had taken to calling George Papa within days of the engagement, and each time they did, she saw his face transform with joy. He was patient with them, firm when needed but generous with affection. He taught Daniel to ride and helped Eli with his letters. He attended their bedtime ritual every night, reading stories and answering endless questions with the same attention he had once given only to ledgers and brandy. He was the father they needed. And more than that, he had become the father he needed to be. "Coming," Jenny called back, but before she could leave the room, strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. "Let them wait a moment," George murmured against her neck, pulling her back against his chest. "I have barely seen you all day." Jenny leaned into him, savoring the warmth and solidity of his embrace. "You saw me at breakfast, at lunch, and you interrupted my meeting with the housekeeper specifically to steal a kiss. That was hours ago." His lips traced the curve of her neck, sending pleasant shivers down her spine. "I am a husband deprived. You are insatiable. Only for you, my Duchess." He turned her in his arms, and Jenny saw the love in his eyes that still made her breath catch. "Have I told you today that you have made me happier than I ever thought possible? At least 3 times. But I never tire of hearing it." He kissed her softly, tenderly, the kind of kiss that spoke of deep contentment rather than urgency. When he pulled back, his hand came up to cup her face, thumb stroking her cheekbone. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "that perhaps we should keep the cottage. Not abandon it, but maintain it. Use it as a retreat when we need quiet, when the house becomes too much, when we want to remember how this all began." Jenny's eyes filled with tears. "I would like that. Very much." The cottage had indeed become their refuge, a place they escaped to sometimes on Sunday afternoons, just the 4 of them, to sit by the fire and be simply a family without titles or expectations. The wreath Jenny had made that first Christmas hung there still, preserved and treasured, a reminder of the courage it had taken to claim joy in the face of darkness. "Papa," Daniel's voice now, more insistent. "Are we going or not?" George sighed dramatically. "Our sons are tyrants. Our sons are impatient." Jenny laughed, taking his hand. "Come, you promised them a ride, and a promise is sacred." They found the boys in the entrance hall, already dressed for riding, their faces bright with anticipation. Thomas had the horses ready, and soon they were trotting through the village, George with Eli before him on the saddle, Jenny riding beside them with Daniel. The villagers waved and called greetings. The Duchess had won their hearts quickly. She remembered names, asked after sick children, contributed to local charities, and moved through the community with the ease of someone who had once been one of them. They loved her for not putting on airs, for treating the baker's wife with the same respect as the vicar, for never forgetting where she came from. At the village green, they stopped to watch children playing. Eli begged to join them, and George helped him down, watching with a smile as both boys ran off to play. "He is good with them," an elderly woman said, approaching Jenny. "Your Duke. My grandson says His Grace taught him to skip stones last week by the stream." Jenny felt pride swell in her chest. "He is a good man. It simply took the right circumstances for everyone to see it." "And you are good for him," the woman continued. "We all see it. The whole estate has come alive since you arrived. It is like watching spring come after a terrible winter." After the woman moved on, George pulled Jenny close to his side. "Did you hear that? You have brought spring to my life. We brought spring to each other." They rode home as the sun began to set, the boys tired and happy, leaning against their parents in their saddles. When they reached the manor, George carried a sleeping Eli inside while Daniel walked between them, holding both their hands. After the boys were bathed and settled into their beds in rooms that had been redecorated with bright colors and filled with toys, George and Jenny stood in the doorway watching them sleep. "Do you ever regret it?" Jenny asked softly. "Taking us in? Changing your entire life?" George turned to her, his expression serious. "I regret only the years I wasted believing I could not be happy again. Every day with you, with them, is a gift I do not deserve, but will spend my life being grateful for." They walked through the quiet house, and Jenny marveled again at the changes. Where darkness had reigned, light now filled every corner. Where silence had suffocated, warmth and laughter had taken root. The house that had been George's prison had become their home. In their bedroom, as they prepared for sleep, George pulled Jenny into his arms. "I have been thinking about next Christmas," he said. "What we might do?" "It is only May," Jenny laughed. "You are planning very far ahead. I want it to be special. I want to establish traditions, things the boys will remember when they are grown, things that will make this house a place of joy for generations." Jenny kissed him softly. "Whatever we do, it will be perfect, because we will be together." That night, as they lay in the darkness, George told her something he had never shared before, how on the worst nights after Catherine and Thomas died, he had sometimes wished he could simply stop existing. How the pain had been so consuming that breathing felt like an act of violence against himself. "And now?" Jenny asked, her hand over his heart. "Now I cannot imagine wanting to miss a single moment. Now every breath feels like a gift." She felt his chest rise and fall beneath her palm. "You saved me, Jenny. You and those boys and that ridiculous wreath made of scraps. You saved me from myself." She rose on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight. "We saved each other." Years passed, and the traditions George had wanted became real. Every Christmas Eve, the entire household gathered for a feast. Every Christmas morning, the family spent time at the cottage before returning to the manor. And every year, without fail, Jenny made a new wreath from pine branches gathered in the forest, sometimes with the boys, later with grandchildren who came along. But the original wreath, the one made on that first desperate night when a widow decided to claim joy despite a duke's edict, never left its place of honor. Each year on Christmas Eve, in a ceremony that became sacred to the family, George would lift that first wreath carefully from its preservation box and carry it to the main entrance of Westcott Hall. There, with Jenny and their children watching, he would hang it on the door, crooked and imperfect and beautiful, and say the words that had become their family motto. "This is the bravest wreath I've ever seen. It reminds us that hope can grow anywhere, even in the darkest winters. It reminds us that love can find us when we least expect it. And it reminds us that sometimes the most valuable things in life are made not from gold or silver, but from courage and stubborn determination to believe in joy." And every year Jenny would add, "It reminds us that we are home." The man who had hated Christmas learned to love it again. The widow who had created light in darkness became a duchess who brought that light to an entire estate. The boys who had known only institutional cold grew up in a house filled with warmth and laughter, eventually bringing their own families to celebrate beneath the crooked wreath that had started it all. And through all the years, whenever December came and snow began to fall, George would stand at his window, not looking for escape, not drowning in brandy and grief, but watching his family prepare for the holiday with joy. He would think of a humble wreath made of scraps, hung on a door in defiance of his edict, and thank God that he had been riding that night, that he had seen it, that he had been brave enough to let it crack the ice around his heart. The Duke of Westcott had tried to kill Christmas, but Christmas, in the form of a widowed maid and her humble wreath, had saved him instead. And that, as it turned out, was the greatest gift of all. In the end, love is what transforms us. Not the grand gestures or the perfect circumstances, but the quiet courage to hope when hope seems foolish, to reach for joy when grief has claimed us, to believe that even the most broken hearts can be made whole again. May you find your own light in the darkness wherever you are. If this story touched your heart, I would be grateful if you would take a moment to leave a like on this video. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. And I would love to know. Comment below and tell me where in the world you are listening from. Your engagement helps me continue creating these stories. Thank you for being here, and may your days be filled with hope and unexpected joy.